All right, let's get started with today's webinar. My name's Alex, and I'm a solutions architect at Plotly, based right here at our headquarters in Montreal, Canada. Today, I'm super excited to be sharing some tips and tricks for creating great Dash apps and leveling up your Dash development workflow. Before we get started, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, feel free to leave them in the sidebar to the right. I'll try to respond to as many as I can at the end of the presentation. And if there are any that I can't get to, one of my colleagues will follow up with you via email. Also, just to note, this webinar is going to be recorded, so you'll be sent the recording, the slides, and some additional resources in the email after the session as well. I'm assuming that if you're at this webinar, you probably already know about Plotly and Dash, so let me skip the information on this slide, and instead I'm going to tell you a bit more about myself, who I am, what I do, how I help Plotly's customers. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm a solutions architect on the professional services team at Plotly. My formal education is in computational cognitive science, and my professional background is in UI UX. On this professional services team, I've worked with clients in a wide range of industries, including pharmaceutical, automotive, even private equity firms, just to name a few. My colleagues and I on the professional services team wanted to share some advice with you that we have seen has drastically improved the projects that we've worked on and have helped our clients get to the next level in terms of Dash development. So I've compiled a list of 10 tips and tricks that I'm going to be sharing with you all today. Here we have this slide with all of the tips that we'll be discussing today. So feel free to use this as a reference when it gets sent to you via email after the webinar. Let's get right into it. My very first tip is on code modularization and how it can help you write easily maintainable and easily testable code. So one common practice we use on the services team is creating utility files for our Dash apps. Instead of crowding our app layouts or callback functions with lines and lines of code to define and generate my charts, I would store all that chart generating code in a file called chartutils.py. You can see in the screenshot that I've included that I have this utils directory. This is where my chart utils and my data utils live. I would say these are the two most common categories of code that we tend to store in their own modules. And you can think of data utilities as any functions that read in a flat file, query a database, or carry out some sort of complex transformation of data. Additionally, if you find yourself developing a Dash app with a lot of functionality all crammed onto one single page, I highly recommend that you break it out into multiple pages. You'll see in my screenshot that I also have another directory called pages, and in it I would store, this is where I would store layouts for each of these individual pages. So for example, homepage.py has a function within it called layout, which will return the layout for the homepage. The same thing goes for the other page, as well as any other pages that I would add to the app. The way that we switch between these layouts is by using the DCC link component, which changes the URL without refreshing the page. And then we use the DCC location component, which reads the URL as input in a callback. And depending on whichever page you're on, it'll call the layout function of the corresponding file. As of Dash 2.6.0, this can also be done using a simpler feature called Dash Pages, which you can learn about in our open source docs. By modularizing your code, It makes it easier to find certain functions or bits of code, and it's much easier to parse multiple 300 to 400 line files rather than one file with thousands and thousands of lines. In the same vein of organizing your code and improving code readability, we have our next tip, which is to maximize code reusability. So if a component or group of components is repeated in your layout, you should try to generalize it into a function. Let's say I have 5 custom cards in my Dash app. Each has a different title, a couple of drop-downs, and a chart. These cards might all be different, but there's a common shape or pattern that I can abstract as a function. And then I can generate the 5 cards using that function and looping through a set of different arguments. This is what's called the dry principle of programming, which stands for don't repeat yourself. And the major advantage of writing code like this is maintainability. So if I wanted to tweak the custom cards in the example I just mentioned, let's say I want an icon in each of the cards, I would have to add that icon 5 times, once for each card. But if I convert that code into a function, I only have to modify it once. Let's see an example of this using real code. So here you'll see I have 2 screenshots of code that are essentially doing the same thing. In both blocks of code, I'm defining a sidebar menu for a Dash app. Let's take a look at the image on the left first. You'll see that at the highest level, everything is wrapped in a div. And then I have multiple DCC link components, each representing a menu item from the sidebar. These could be links to other pages, external resources, whatever. They each have an icon implemented using the Dash iconify package, a title stored in a div, and an href, which specifies the URL that the link directs to. Each of the 5 links has been hard-coded into my layout, so if I make a decision to change something about the links, I would have to make that change 5 times, just as with my previous example. Now let's take a look at my proposed solution, so the better way to do it, which is the image to the right. You'll see that I've defined all of the variables of my sidebar menu items, the things that actually change or differ from link to link, as a list of dictionaries called menu. Each dictionary in this list tells me what icon, title, and href URL I need for a given menu item. I've kept this list of dictionaries within the function just so you all could see it, but it can obviously be stored somewhere else and passed in as an argument into the function. Next, you'll see that I have my outer div for the sidebar menu, same as the original version of the code on the left. However, here's the key difference, right? Using a little bit of Python list comprehension magic, I define the children of the outer div. So I've abstracted the common pattern of each of the links. They're all DCC links. They all have this dash iconify icon. They all have a title within the div, and then with a class name, and then they all have some URL that they're pointing to. After I define this pattern, I write for item in menu, which is going to iterate through menu, my list of dictionaries, and we're going to generate one of these links for each item in menu. So for my first dictionary in menu, I'm going to generate a link with icon 1, the title 1, and href 1. The same will happen for my second dictionary item, the third, etc., until I have essentially generated the same block of code as what you see on the left. So hopefully you can see from these examples that turning repeated code into functions not only reduces the amount of code that you need to write now, but it also reduces the amount of code that you need to write in the future, if ever anything needs to be changed or fixed. Awesome, let's go on to the next tip. On the topic of code formatters. So we've mentioned readability a few times. Obviously, it's an important issue regardless of whatever kind of software you're developing or what programming language you're working in, but I think readability is especially important when writing Dash code because you need to be able to visually parse your layout as you're building it. So across the professional services team, we all use Black as our main Python formatter of choice, but when you're working on a team, it's not as important which code formatter you're using, rather that you're all using a shared format configuration. By following a shared format, you're not only ensuring readability of your code, but you can also reduce a whole bunch of diffs and merge conflicts in your version control system as well. So if everyone on my team is following the same format, that guarantees that any of the changes to the files are meaningful rather than just some additional spaces or tabs thrown in. Our next tip is also going to make your life a bit easier and improve your workflow for Dash development, and it's on virtual environment managers. So for those of you who don't know what a Python virtual environment is, you can think of it as a folder structure that contains an isolated version of Python and Python packages. With a virtual environment manager, you can keep separate environments with these different versions of Python and packages, and you can easily switch between each one whenever you want. If you're somebody who works on at least 2 or more different Python projects at once, you can definitely benefit from using a virtual environment manager. You might have 2 different Dash apps, and they both use Dash, obviously, but different versions of Dash and different versions of other external packages. Using a virtual environment manager, you won't have to pip install those different packages every time you switch between working on a project. And additionally, if you run into any major dependency issues, it's way easier to completely wipe a virtual environment or create a new one rather than to have to wipe your base environment. The professional services team always uses virtual environments in tandem with requirements files in our code bases. So we write these TXT files that indicate all the different external packages that you need and the specific versions. So what needs to be installed for the app to work. That way, any developer who is onboarding onto the project or anyone trying to run the app can simply just create a new virtual environment and then pip install that requirements.txt file, and they should be able to run the app with no problem. All right, our next tip is on debugging. I know this isn't most people's favorite part of development, but it's inevitable. Nobody writes perfect code 100% of the time, right? So when you eventually run into callback errors in your Dash app, we recommend a variety of solutions. Using print statements within your callback is the simplest way to gain insight and introspection into your code. So you can check whether a variable is the correct value or if it's the correct type. I personally really like to use the built-in Python debugger in VS Code, which is my IDE of choice, but you can use any Python debugger that you want. Especially with callbacks, it's super helpful to be able to step through your code line by line and see all the different variables as they change during runtime. Dash also has a variety of development tools built into it, such as the callback graph, which I've included a screenshot of on this slide. You can turn on the dev tools in your app simply by setting debug equals true in the app.runServer function call. And the callback graph, as you can see, has these blue and green shapes. The blue shapes represent input and output component properties that are used in callbacks, and the green bubbles represent the callback functions themselves. This callback graph will tell you whether or not a callback was successful, the number of times the callback was fired, which is this number up top, and then the amount of time that a callback request took, which is this number down below in milliseconds. That last one is actually especially helpful because it can help you identify performance bottlenecks in your callbacks as well. So take a look through the documentation on -dev-tools in our open source docs for more information on the callback graph. My next tip for you all is to use descriptive component IDs. When you start building a Dash app from scratch, maybe you only have a couple of drop downs, couple of charts, and just a callback or two to tie them together functionally. You'll only have a handful of component IDs that you actually have to remember at this stage, but as your app gets bigger, as your callbacks become more complex, there's going to be an overwhelming amount of IDs that you need to remember. So I don't recommend you actually remember all of these IDs. By giving your components descriptive IDs, you can make it much easier to identify what the component is, what it controls, and the other components that it links to. So for example, let's say you have a Dash data table with all sorts of global population statistics, and the first column is country. If you have a dropdown that filters the country column, you can name the ID table country dropdown. I usually like to indicate what the component is at the end of the ID. So here, you know, very clearly it's a dropdown. And you can tell what it connects to or what it's filtering. I do this even when I'm just building a small Dash app. It makes it much easier when you're coming back to old code that you wrote a long time ago, especially when the IDs are self-descriptive. It's also very helpful when you're working with other team members or collaborators as they try to onboard themselves onto a code base, or they're trying to understand new code that you've written. And one last advantage that I'll add, if you remember the callback graph from the last tip, having descriptive component IDs also makes parsing that graph much simpler. As you can see, you clearly know which component ID is which, and you know how they all relate to each other. All right. Number 7, don't store large amounts of data in DCC store. So DCC store is a super useful tool for storing small bits of data as JSON to be used throughout your app. This data is stored client-side in the browser, meaning it's not ideal for large, let alone massive data sets. If you're looking to store something with 1 million plus rows, we actually recommend that you move it to a database instead. So a large portion of professional services clients are using enterprise solutions for their databases, such as AWS or Microsoft Azure. But there's also a lot of our projects that use open source database solutions as well, such as Redis or Postgres. And we highly recommend that you use these to store your large amounts of data instead of in a DCC store. I want to add here that this process is made even simpler using Dash Enterprise, which is our enterprise deployment platform. It handles all the headaches of deploying a Dash app for you, so you don't need an IT team or a DevOps team. And more importantly, on our point of storing data, Dash Enterprise allows you to spin up Redis and Postgres databases trivially, just using the UI. And next up, we're going to be talking about the persistence property. So if you have a bunch of controls in your app, such as dropdowns or text inputs, you might want to save your users' inputs so that the next time they access the app, these controls are already populated. Or maybe let's say you have an app with a tabbed layout using DCC tabs, and every time you switch back and forth between tabs, your inputs are getting cleared. That forces you to have to make all those selections again. The solution to this problem is the persistence property. So all of our control components, drop-downs, radio buttons, text inputs, a whole lot more, they all come with a property called persistence. And all you have to do is set persistence equals true to activate this feature. I can also use persistence to tie a component with another component. Let's say I have two drop-downs. One is a list of countries, and the other is a list of cities based on the country that you've selected. So for the city drop-down, I can write persistence equals country dash drop-down, or whatever the ID of the country drop-down is. And that'll make it so that whatever country I've selected, the city drop-down will auto-select the last city that I've selected for that given country. So if I've selected Canada and Montreal, I can then play around with the country drop-down. I can select USA or China. And then when I eventually come back to Canada, the city drop-down will have persisted my last selection, and it will automatically select Montreal for me. I also want to mention that there are 3 different types of persistence. There's memory, local, and session. Memory means that the persistence is deleted upon refreshing the browser. So I would only recommend you use that when you want to persist filters across a tabbed app, but not more than that. Local and session will both save your filters on refresh, but local will save your persistence in the browser indefinitely, whereas session will delete it once the browser is closed. So persistence is super useful when you're building an app with lots and lots of controls that the user wants to set once and then keep coming back to. My next tip is related to the UX of your Dash app. Streamlining your Dash app's user flow. What does that even mean? Let's break it down together. So user flow, that refers to the step-by-step path that a user takes to complete a task using a product. For example, we can think about the payment process of any given e-commerce site. What are the different inputs that the user needs to fill in? Is it their name, address, credit card information? Is it clear to them what order they need to fill all of this information in? And usually, web payments are split into pages, which the user works through in a linear fashion. So they review their cart, fill in their information, they confirm the payment, and then you're shown this confirmation screen. Thank you for your purchase. I think that meticulously thinking about user flow is essential during the earliest stages of development before you've even written a single line of code, because you want to make sure that what you have planned and what you'll be building isn't overly complicated. I've actually seen many examples of Dash apps with very poor user flow or very complicated, unnecessarily complicated user flow, such as filters for charts placed all over the place, forcing you to actively find them, or a feature of an app where you have to go from one page to another and then jump back to the first page. So to pat myself on the back a little bit, I've provided an example of a Dash app that I've built with what I like to think is good user flow. This app was made to serve as the front end for an existing machine learning prediction model. And this screenshot is the control panel for the app. So this is where the user would tweak different parameters for the prediction model and then run it. Let's take a look at it in order as the user would. So first of all, the user needs to select an ID from the dropdown. I've set the dropdown to display the very first option of the dropdowns, or of the options for the dropdown, and it's not clearable, so we don't run into a situation where the user has not selected a dropdown, or sorry, not selected an ID and still tries to run the algorithm. And then after that, we have two sets of radio buttons, prediction type and date type. These are simple enough as radio buttons, they imply that they're single selection, and like the dropdown, an option always has to be selected at all times. So you're never going to have a situation where I'm trying to generate a prediction without a prediction type selected, or generate a prediction without a date type selected. Next comes the start and end dates for the model. This is where it gets a little bit interesting. So you can't see it in the screenshot, but the available start and end dates are actually dependent on the ID selection. So there's a callback that, based on whatever ID you've selected, it's changing the possible ranges for start date and end date. You'll also see that because I haven't entered a start date time, the end date time controls are grayed out. That's because the end date time is also dependent on the start date time, because we can't have a user putting in an end date time that is before the start date time, right? We then have this time interval selection. This is a number input. So the user selects a time interval with the minimum value being 1, because there's no such thing as intervals of 0 hours. And then lastly, we have these two buttons, reset and submit. They do exactly as they say. The reset button will reset all of the filters, and the submit button will submit, will run the ML model and generate a prediction. So when you're designing the user flow of your Dash app, I'd encourage you to think about it step by step, like this, the way I've walked you through this control panel, and try to imagine the potential problems that the user might encounter or even cause by themselves, and then try to come up with solutions to prevent those problems. My 10th and final tip is going to be a demo where I'll show you how to easily style your Dash app using Dash Design Kit's theme editor. So I'm going to switch over to this app over here. And to give you a little bit of context, Dash Design Kit is our enterprise package that allows you to arrange, style, customize Dash apps so that they can be deployed in no time. It comes with a design GUI called the theme editor, which it lets you professionally style your app in just a few clicks. The app that I'm showing you right now is using one of our dozens of preset themes. So everything on this page, everything in this app, from the page background color to the font sizes, even down to things such as like the padding in the cards, those are all predefined in the preset theme, and they're all customizable. As you see, as soon as I click on a different theme, the entire look and feel of the app changes, right? Everything is different. different colors, different fonts, different border styling for the cards. So let's say my company is developing an app. We're developing a Dash app, and our brand colors are blue and green. Let me go ahead and pick this one. It's light blue preset theme. And then I would go into colors. Actually, no, I'm going to pick a dark theme. And then I would go into colors. And you can see this text, this medium blue on dark blue isn't as readable. So I'm going to pick a lighter text color just to make it more readable. And then I can change my graph colors. Over here, you can change your graph colors, customize. I'm going to use green and blue to match my company's brand colors. And then I can go into the typography section, and I don't really like this serif font, so I can use something else. Let's see. Poppins is a good one. Yeah, that looks pretty good. I'm also not a fan of these rounded borders on the cards. So I can go into the container section and I would choose box shadow, which is going to give all of my cards this slightly raised, almost 3D look. And there is also a panel for styling your controls. These are your drop downs, inputs, date pickers, buttons. I'm okay with the way things look right now, so I won't make any changes here. All right, I'm pretty happy with the way the app looks, so I'm going to go ahead and save my theme. The way you do that is just creating a JavaScript file in your assets directory called theme.js. And any of the changes that you've made using this GUI will be reflected in this block of code over here. So all you need to do is to copy and paste into theme.js. For those of you who have a bit of CSS experience, you'll also be happy to know that you can fine-tune your Dash Design Kit theme even more than what's shown in the theme editor. So everything saved in your theme.js file is actually, these are all using CSS variables, which are ultimately what your Design Kit components are reading and using. If I wanted to change the background page, for example, I'm not tied to using the GUI. I can just change that in the code if I know the hex code or name of the color that I want for the background color. All right. While I'm also demoing this app for you, I want to mention a couple of things. So this button over here, the callback graph that I told you all about earlier, and the dev tools. When you see this, when you set debug equals to true in app.runServer, you'll see this button affixed to the bottom right corner of your app. And here, all I have to do is click it, and it's going to bring up these options. This one over here shows me whether or not the server is online. So if right now this app is being run locally. So if I exit that, if I stop running the app, this will say server is unavailable. This one would be the error or the callback error log, and it will show you all your callback errors. And then this one is the one that I was telling you about earlier. So by clicking this, it will toggle on my callback graph. And you can see all I have here are two callbacks. I have my app URL informing the content of the app, which I explained in the code modularization tip. And then I also have a dropdown. This dropdown over here, I can choose a different stock ticker, and it's going to change this graph. So as you can see, I've made sure to give my components very descriptive IDs as well. All right, So my demo on the theme editor was our 10th and final tip. Let me just end this real quick. And I have a summary for you all. So what did we talk about today? We talked about how you should and can make your code more readable and more easily maintained using modularization and converting your code into functions. I taught you all a bit about how to simplify your workflow using things like virtual environment managers and code formatters. Both of those tools are going to make your life much easier. And we discussed when to or not to use certain components, such as DCC store. And finally, we wrapped it up with some points on UI UX. I'd recommend, if you want to continue your learning and get more in-depth information on all of the tips that I highlighted today, you should check out the docs for Dash open source, as well as the Plotly community forum. I know that when I first started learning Dash, these were two of the most helpful resources available to me. So I think they would be useful for you all as well. Alrighty. We have a little bit of time to answer the questions that were sent in. So I'm going to take a quick look at what you guys have asked me. Let's see. Okay, yeah, this is a good one. Do you have some general tips for designing a Dash app related to UI? Sure. Let's see. Off the top of my head, I can think of a couple things. So web development follows a lot of the same principles as just basic graphics design. So as much as you can, I would say try to limit the number of different fonts that you're using. I think that for a Dash app, one font family is more than enough. And then I would also say to consider different screen sizes when you're developing your app. I've personally have seen so many apps that have been obviously developed on a laptop monitor, and they never considered people who are using wider screens or using super wide monitors all day, and vice versa, right? People who are developers who use their monitor all day and they don't think that somebody is trying to view the app on a smaller monitor or a smaller screen, and the app ends up looking very squished. So keep different screen sizes in mind. Okay. How can I access Dash Design Kit? Is there a way to access a default theme color scheme on the theme.js file? How does the .js theme and CSS file combine? Does the CSS overwrite the theme or vice versa? So Dash Design Kit, that is our enterprise Dash component package. And it's more than components, it comes with a lot more. But so you would have to, I would recommend that you visit our website at plotly.com and request a demo for Dash Enterprise, and we'll show you all the wonders of the deployment platform that is Dash Enterprise, as well as Dash Design Kit. And once you become an enterprise client or an enterprise customer, you'll have full access to Dash Design Kit. And for those of you watching who are Dash Enterprise customers, I don't believe there's a default color scheme for the theme.js file, but we, as enterprise clients, you have access to a whole bunch of templates. So you can just use one of our template apps and then boot up the theme editor, pick one of the preset themes. And as to how does the JS or the theme.js file and the CSS file, how do they combine? That's a really great question, and it's something that I have to deal with every day. So the theme.js is kind of the source of truth for styling. Those are being used as CSS variables for your Dash Design Kit components, and they take precedence over everything. So if you have a CSS file, obviously you can style certain things, but you would have to look into CSS class specificity. If you're just simply saying, oh, I want my dropdowns to look like this, more often than not, if you're using Dash Design Kit, I would recommend you just change that in the theme.js file. CSS is kind of for all the things that, or if you create a CSS file linked to your app, it would be for all the things that the theme editor is not accounting for, or any of the minutia you want to change. Do you prefer structuring the code across separate Python files and importing them, or following an object-oriented programming class-based architecture? I would say throughout my Dash development career, I have rarely used object-oriented programming for Dash development. So I really think that, splitting your code structure into different modules and just importing them wherever needed, that's more than enough. There are certain cases where you are doing more advanced things that you could do object-oriented programming, but I don't think it's necessary. What is the best equivalent to black to use in Jupyter? Great question. And that's something that I had wondered for a long time too. And turns out there is black for Jupyter. So you can just, I think it's a Python package as well. And you just install that and it will format your code in your Jupyter notebooks as well, which is really cool. Do you recommend any books to learn more about Dash? Yeah, that's an excellent question. Adam Schroeder, who I hope a lot of you already know, he is our excellent community engagement manager. He just wrote a new book called Book of Dash, which you should all keep an eye out for. And I think it's going to be a great supplement to, or I should say, this webinar that I've given today is a peek into what he would be teaching you in that book. How can I work with professional services? That's a great question. You can visit our website at plotly.com, as I said, and request a demo for Dash Enterprise. And there you can inquire about professional services, what we can do for you. And alternatively, you can also email info@plotly.com, where my colleagues will put you in touch with us, the professional services team, or they'll answer any other questions that you might have that I can't get to today. Is it possible to combine drop-down with radio buttons or checkboxes? Like when the user clicks on the drop-down, we get a list of checkboxes for multi-select. Yeah, that is a really great question. I personally have a sort of hacky way of doing that. I would have to, my answer to this would have to be, no, there isn't some option for, checkboxes or radio buttons out of the box. But what you can do is, I believe, you can take a Dash Bootstraps component, the Dash Bootstraps dropdown, or sorry, that you could take a Dash Core Components dropdown and put Dash Bootstraps checklist inside it as the options. And that, there are some styling issues with that, but again, like I said, I would say out of the box, no, there's no pre-made solution for that. What is the best practice to handle a database connection across different callbacks? Good question. So I would say, let me give this example. For example, if I'm connecting to a client's AWS database, whichever one of those database solutions that they have, that database solution might have an official Python package that allows me to make queries to the database. And so I would create, again, another module just for making data queries And then, if I have different callbacks, maybe this callback is trying to display a table. This one is trying to display a chart. There are situations where you can make one large query, pulling on all the data from a table and then saving it into a data frame, a pandas data frame, and just call it DF and use it across your different pages. It's not the ideal way to do it. So a better, more dynamic way is for all of the components that you're trying to populate, right? For example, a table, you just, in your callback, you're just making a dynamic query just for the things that you need in that given situation. I hope that answers your question. Do you have any advice for mobile responsiveness in Dash apps? That's a great question. So with Dash Design Kit, our enterprise package, it actually comes with mobile layout support out of the box. So it comes with building blocks for your layouts. So blocks, cards, rows, and these are all mobile responsive. I would say for Dash open source, this is a little bit trickier. You can look into Dash Mantine components, which is a third-party component library that we really like to use on the professional services team. And then I believe they have a component called media query, which will detect whether or not the screen size is a certain size. That does multiple things, right? So if you're resizing your window on your laptop, that will resize. Your app can make those detections and then resize certain cards or hide certain elements. So if there's not enough space for all the charts and your sidebar and your header, it'll hide some of those. And you can use that to develop your app in a more mobile friendly way. Have any? What component packages should I use? I like Dash Bootstrap components. Okay, yeah. So as I said earlier, Dash Mantine components is a fantastic third-party component library. I highly recommend that you all check it out. There are a lot of things in that library that I don't believe have been implemented in other packages yet. So to some extent, some of those components are actually essential if you're trying to build out a very complex and polished app. With Dash Enterprise, can users choose predefined charts and tables for their personalized dashboard and save that to their profile? Yes, great question. So Dash Enterprise has a couple of solutions. I'm not exactly sure what your specific use case is, but there's a couple of ways of implementing something to address this. We have something called Dashboard Engine, which is a fully zero code interface, or once you've implemented it, it's a fully zero code interface. And you just put a canvas onto a Dash app with UI elements that allow you to generate charts. So instead of having to go into my code, write Python code and create a Plotly chart and some drop downs, I just go to my Dashboard Engine app and I can click a few things. It'll generate a scatter plot. I can pick what the x-axis and the y-axis is, as long as my data is connected to the right source. And then you can have that. You can create a default layout for that and then allow your user to add more charts on top of that. And then we also have a feature called the snapshot engine, which it does a number of different things, but what it does essentially is it saves the layout of your app as JSON. So you can have you can mix Dashboard Engine with snapshots. So you can create a number of different charts using Dashboard Engine, just clicking through your app, and then you save the layout using snapshots. It'll save it to Dash Enterprise, our deployment platform, and then it has a number of different authentication features as well. So you can make sure that each user is looking at only their list of different saved layouts, and you can switch between those. Hopefully that answers your question. Could you elaborate a bit more on the code structure recommendations, specifically on the utils? Give specific examples. Yeah, sure. So actually that tip can be very easily combined with the tip that came after that. So reusing your code using functions and then modularizing your code. So let's say, for example, I have an app with many, many scatter plots, right? They're all plotly scatter plots. Instead of in my layout writing px.scatter over and over again and redefining them over and over and over again, what I can do is I can create my chart utils folder, or sorry, chart utils file within my utils folder. And then in chart utils, I'll create a function that creates a scatter plot. And then maybe it takes different arguments, like the title of the chart differs from chart to chart. The data frame passed into the chart is different. The X and Y axes are different. So those can be, those are the things that abstract out, right? The common pattern is that it is a px.scatter or some other plotly figure. And then what I do is I don't have to define the whole thing over and over and again in my code. I just have to call that function any number of times. I can do something similar to the example that I showed you all earlier. So I can have a list of dictionaries or just a dictionary or something, and then I can store all those different the differing values that are going to be my arguments for the chart generating function. So if I have different titles for the charts, if they have different data frames, these are all the arguments, right? I just loop through that. Feel free to ask follow-up questions. I know that one is a little bit trickier to understand, but it's a very important concept to grasp to really get yourself to the next level of Dash development. My company has a very unique use case. How can I get in touch with someone at Plotly to talk about it? Again, feel free to reach out to us at info@plotly.com. But other than that, if you want to request a Dash Enterprise demo, or you want us, the professional services team, to help you build out a Dash app, please feel free to visit our website at plotly.com. And there's going to be a little button that says request a demo. You can go there, you can fill out some information, and then we'll be in touch with you shortly to give you a demo, to walk you through all the different the benefits and features of Dash Enterprise and the things that come with it, as well as if you want to request professional services help, you can do so on that call as well. Let's see. If I want to use Dash at my company, is there a minimum requirement of users to do so? I'm not sure off the top of my head. That one we should be able to get back to you on. So please, again, okay, I'm being told that the answer is no. There is no minimum requirement of users to use Dash Enterprise at your company. So one user or many, however many that you want, it's all okay. Let's see. All right, I think we are, yes, we're getting close to the top of the hour, and that's about all the time that we have for today. Thank you all so much for joining, and I hope that you were able to learn something new today. Look out for the recording after the webinar, along with the slides and some additional resources. As always, feel free to reach out to us at info@plotly.com if you have any questions. Have a great day, everyone. Take care.